Riley, what's up?
This meeting is being recorded.
This meeting is being recorded.
There you have it.
Got it.
Riley, good to see you. Marcus, Jimmy, Kelly, Corey's iPhone. Hi, Corey's iPhone.
Hello.
Oh, the one way Corey Sandhagen.
Thanks for inviting me.
How you doing, Corey?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm good.
All right. I'm gonna go back to the other image, but thanks for inviting me.
Yep.
What do you think, Del? Should we go ahead and get started since we know people are kind of going to jump in and out as they can?
Yeah, I know there's a few other people who I know are going to be getting in, so let's give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll fire it off. Riley, good to see you, buddy. Glad you jumped on. I know you got a bunch of stuff going on, but glad you're here. I think you're going to enjoy this.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
A little choppy there. You're cutting out there.
So
It's all good. It's all good. Glad you're on.
For now.
Yeah.
Well, I guess a couple of quick housekeeping things while we're maybe waiting for a few more people to jump on. Heather is going to give our special guest a formal welcome, but really quickly, I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to hop on today. We have a lot of our circle members on, and I've got some announcements for you guys, which I will send out in an email after this call, just to make sure we have as much time to listen today as we can. We're gonna have Del kind of moderating this conversation, but if you have questions throughout, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm gonna monitor the chat box as the conversation is taking place, so that we can be sure to get all of your questions in, and then we'll have some brief Q&A at the end, maybe about 10 minutes for those who want to jump in and just ask questions directly. So I guess without further ado, Heather, I will turn it over to you to introduce our guest for the day.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to make the intro. You all are with Dr. Gunther Weil. We believe he is a national treasure. He was one of the core graduate student members and the only remaining member of the Harvard Psilocybin project. And those notable studies that everybody knows about, like the Concord prison experiment and the Good Friday experiment. And he worked really closely with Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner and Richard Alpert. You remember Dick as Ram Dass. So legends in their own right. Gunther is the founder and CEO of Value Mentors. He is an internationally recognized organizational consultant, an executive coach, a family advisor, and an educator who has for many years provided guidance and coaching to executives and their organizations in the areas of value-based leadership, innovation, team building, strategic planning, including executive wellness. He received his doctorate from Harvard University in 1965. Was a Fulbright scholar in Europe, and was actually subsequently recruited by Abraham Maslow to teach at Brandeis University. So I just wanted to share my love and my respect and my admiration for Gunther. His work has changed me, and we've gone through his value mentoring process, my family, and it has allowed us to not just recognize and understand our worldview and therefore our values, but to focus on and live our values. It's the first time I've intentionally lived really in my life. So it's sanctioned us to have such an impactful and purpose-driven life. And so I have so much gratitude and respect for you, Gunther. And I just love sitting at your feet. You have to have your pens ready. I'm glad this is being recorded. I've never been in a situation with Gunther where he didn't drop knowledge that I'm like, oh, that's a pearl that I want to hold for forever. And I want you guys to indulge me real quick. You wrote this, you could have wrote this morning, but you wrote this in 1963. The synthesis of consciousness, by the way, we can send out the psychedelic reader. You can still find this book. The synthesis of consciousness expanding substances, which we regard as one of the most outstanding achievements of technological society, has now provided us with a means of transcending and overcoming many of the distortions which operate in the very society that has brought about these substances. It is now possible to affirm the general character of our social tenocracy without succumbing to its totalitarian demands. The creation and furtherance of internal freedom for large numbers of people through the intelligent use of psychedelic substances are now a practical reality. I recommend you guys get this. It is, they used to do a psychedelic review, and so a lot of the papers are in this book. I think you may be trying to work on a new one, but enough from me. We're so glad you're here with these movers and shakers on the call today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm looking forward to this. It's always fun to, do these narrations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gunther. I guess we'll kind of dive in. I think it's incredibly relevant to kind of start at almost the very beginning, your history as a refugee. I'd be curious if you would dive into that aspect of your life and the beginning, if you will.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, it's an interesting point because it also relates to my own healing. I was born in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1937. On Kristallnacht of November 9th, 1938, the Gestapo came to our home. I was 1 year old, and took my dad away, and he was sent to Buchenwald. My mother got him out because he had French papers. He was born in Alsace-Lorraine in 1920. So after the First World War, the Alsace region, which historically had been contested between Germany and France, was awarded to France by the Treaty of Versailles. So he had French citizenship, and they literally pushed him out of the gates of Buchenwald, and he hitchhiked and walked his way back to Frankfurt, and we left within a few months on one of the last boats, apparently out of Hamburg. So we came to the US in 39 and built a life. I was 2 years old, and one of, relevant to our conversation today, one of the things I began working on in the early 60s at Harvard with Tim and Ramdas, or Richard, who I still always called him Richard, so I knew him in that context. That one of the things I worked on was my own healing from was essentially kind of survivor guilt syndrome and essentially pre-verbal, pre-cognitive trauma, which is very difficult to get at through verbal therapy. Those of you who are therapists will understand that point particularly well. So I was able to uncover some of those memories and work with them at that time. And also in the last couple of years, given the so-called Renaissance, I've been interested in kind of jumping back in. So I've been very selective about the use of psychedelics. I've had a number of solo sessions that I've conducted here in this office, sitting on this chair behind me, with a mask for about 6 hours and programming the music, because we kind of Tim coined the term set and setting, which is now bandied about quite freely and often not even properly attributed. So Tim said to Ellen, my wife, once when I brought her to meet him about a year or two before he died, he turned to her and looked at me and turned to her and said, "Yeah, Gunther's a good navigator." So I've been doing that exploration now in my 85th year in preparing for my own transition. I'm not expecting to go, but one never knows. But in the spirit of wishing to die consciously, I'm doing that work again, and tidying up some, there's still some interesting traumatic threads that arise in consciousness that they don't have the compulsion or the potency they had, but they still need a little bit of tidying up and cleaning up. So.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. And kind of leading you to Harvard, I know that, you were a big jazz fan and you kind of spent time in clubs and whatnot. Is that what led you to the mentality, obviously in the 60s, to even have the guts to take psychedelics? Can you tell us a little bit about the jazz era for you in particular, and how, my understanding, how that led to your interest in this category?
Yeah, I grew up in Milwaukee, where after we immigrated, we ended up, after a couple of years, my father was a professor, and I was introduced early on to, well, first of all, my family was very musical. My dad was a pianist and a violinist. He actually played piano in silent movies, when he was a kid, when he was an adolescent. And so I grew up in classical music family, in an upper middle class, educated, academic Jewish family. But, one day I think I heard Count Basie, or I don't know who it was, and one thing led to another, and I ended up kind of in a bebop aficionado. So influences for me at that time were in where I grew up in that era was the beatniks. It was Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, who, by the way, had a couple of sessions with back in not Ginsberg, not Kerouac. So I grew up in a jazz scene in Milwaukee. My closest friend, who passed away a few years ago, Mike Melvoin, he and I used to go hang out in the black jazz clubs in Milwaukee. There were two of them, and it was interesting because these white boys, we were just really like 17, 18 years old, maybe even younger. We were like an anomaly, in that context. So, but people were very friendly, and they loved the fact that we loved, the music. So I kind of grew up in that era, if you will, and having spent a year on a Fulbright in Paris, in Norway, I spent a lot of time in Paris with a lot of expat musicians like Bud Powell and Oscar Pettiford. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with some of these names from that period, but it was in the left bank, and there were like 3 jazz clubs on the Rue Saint Benoit, the street on the hotel that I kind of had a long-term stay. So this has very much been a part of my life and continues to be. I was an amateur jazz drummer, and again, jazz in particular and world music and classical music have been so much a part of the fabric of my life.
Jazz drummer. I'll add that to the one thing I didn't know about you on this go round. I'm sure next time we talk, there'll be another thing that you tell me that you've done that will shock me. So,
but by the way, just to follow up on the lead you gave me, which I didn't, growing up in that context, I was exposed to cannabis very, very early, right? Because that was just part of the fabric of that lifestyle. So having had a lot of experience with cannabis when I was quite young, when I met Tim, which I think you're about to ask me that story, having had some experience with so-called, what we called at that time, kind of altered states of consciousness, I was curious as to what the psychedelics might promise.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going as far as leading into, cannabis expanding your consciousness in ways to give you the courage to step into psychedelics. How did that happen? How did you first decide that was something you were going to go towards? And was that at Harvard with Tim Leary?
Yeah, I began my graduate work in the fall of 1960. I had spent the summer in Cambridge beforehand working with, particularly with a very famous psychologist, therapist, and who later was actually took psilocybin with Tim. And then I walked into what was then called the Center for Research in Personality on a very auspicious street called 5 Divinity Avenue. And and met Tim Leary, who turned out to be, was appointed my faculty advisor. I didn't know who he was. I had done a little bit of research beforehand. Of course, we didn't have the internet then, but I knew of him in the sense of that he had developed one of the most robust and sophisticated assessments of personality that had been in growing use in the field of clinical psychology. And so I thought that would be what I might be focusing on. But when I got into his office, which was a converted utility closet on the first floor of that building, because Tim came onto the scene late. He was invited by another well-known psychologist at that time, David McClellan, to come to Harvard. And so there was barely room for him. So they created this little office for him, converted the utility closet into an office. So I met him there, and he was super charming and friendly and articulate and fun and brilliant. And I was really enjoying the conversation. And at one point he said, last summer I was in Mexico in Cuernavaca with Maria Sabina, I've forgotten exactly the last name, and took the curandero and took mushrooms, and it changed my life. So I'm now what I'm interested in is consciousness and the role that particularly psilocybin can play in that. So he said, if you're interested in that, I'm happy to work with you as your advisor and kind of join the team. And if not, you'd be better off working with somebody else. And I said, just sign me up, so and within a week, I had my first psilocybin session with him and a few other people, including Ralph Metzger. I don't think Richard was at that session. I think it was subsequent to that, but we were off and running. And this was in the fall of 1960.
So just for clarity, are you saying that Timothy Leary's experience was with the one and only Maria Sabina?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. I was unaware of that. That's
but to the best of my knowledge, that
okay.
That was in again in Cuernavaca, and he was with a number of other people, including his close friend Frank Barron, who was a well-known psychologist at the time, had done some very important work on creativity. They were both Irishmen, and they had a tendency to drink a lot. And one of the things that actually shifted for them in terms of their own habits was they moved away from a kind of marginal alcoholism, because alcohol was sort of their substance of choice. Interestingly enough, though, Tim had a very negative attitude towards marijuana because it was illegal, and of course there was nothing illegal about psilocybin at that point, or all that scheduling came later, right? In the Nixon administration, and there are a lot of stories about that. I'm happy to share some of those with you, including the role that G. Gordon Liddy played in the fabric of this whole situation. So, but Tim, when I I smoked a joint once with Tim at his home, and he got upset with me because it was illegal at that time. So that didn't last too long, that attitude, but it's kind of an interesting anecdote. On the one hand, like so anyway.
Yeah, there you have it. Gunther was scolded by Tim Leary for smoking marijuana. That's not very many people can say that. Very cool. So I would like to get into the stages of, when things became illegal and things of that nature. But let's back up just a moment to your first experience. Tell us about that. I mean, for your very first psilocybin trip there with Tim, how was that for you? What did that do and set your course? How did it set your course?
Well, it changed my life. And by the way, I should also mention within the first 2 weeks of graduate school, I got married and also had my first psilocybin trip. And luckily the marriage lasted for 23 years. So it was, I didn't have any buyer's remorse, so to speak, So again, given my background, I came from, as I mentioned earlier, an academic, intellectual, middle-class family. I majored in psychology and philosophy at Kenyon College, where I did my undergraduate work. And so I had a very strong orientation around concepts, in the mind and being an intellectual, and the kind of the identity I had crafted over a lot of years of growing up in my family and then going to college and then university, and all of that kind of got turned inside out, right? Because in that first session, there was a deep transformation, an abiding and non-conceptual awareness, and the realization of how thought is really a function of consciousness. It's one function of consciousness, and one that serves us well when it's a servant, and when it rules us as a master is pretty authoritarian and gets us into a lot of trouble. So I had, some very deep insights. I was primed for it, given my background in philosophy and psychology, but all of that was academic and conceptual. And so this was this is where the rubber hit the road, if you will, of really experiencing the non-conceptual abiding in consciousness. That's what that was about, and of course, particularly with psilocybin, as with mescaline and some other related substances, there was a very profound aesthetic dimension also, and particularly with psilocybin, the sensory aesthetic elements of that compared, for example, the kind of let me just spell out a little bit more. When I say the aesthetic sensory elements were extremely warm, extremely seductive, in contrast to many of my LSD experiences and DMT experiences, where those were other dimensions. Those were more cosmic dimensions, if you will, of kind of more what in Buddhist Buddhist terms we would understand as emptiness and non-dual emptiness prior to the rising of any form. So psilocybin was those early psilocybin experiences, given what the setting and the dosage and what we were exploring had a different quality.
So you have this experience with Tim Leary and your course is set. And then can you tell us about some of the studies that you guys had lifted off and some of the, all the references that all these organizations are making today are the work that you were doing, Concord, the Good Friday experiment. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the studies that you were part of?
Yeah, I would say there are kind of three dimensions of that. One is the kind of week to week, exploration. We were holding psilocybin sessions every weekend, basically, practically every weekend. And part of that were people coming in and out into Cambridge from all over the world, and exploring for themselves with us as guides their own psychedelic space. So that included people like Allen Ginsberg, who had had his own experiences, and Arthur Kessler, so I think he was a sociologist, social psychologist for that time, and Hollywood people, and a lot of people from New York, and musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Mingus, and on and on. So there was that whole process. So then there was the Concord Prison Project. In my first psilocybin session, one of the people there was a psychiatrist, interesting character, who was the resident psychiatrist for Concord Prison. He was a Black man who was also gay. And at that time, you can imagine, what kind of baggage that represented for him. He was married to a beautiful Black woman beauty contestant winner, and that was kind of his cover, and so it was very interesting. He tripping with him, and then the exploration of his worldview and his challenges, what he was attempting to do with his life, given the prejudices and the biases. So anyway, we kind of conceived the idea. I think the idea had been conceived, but we out of that session came a proposal which we gave to the State Department of Mental Health and the Massachusetts Department of Corrections to do a study at Concord Prison to see if the use of psilocybin could be deployed to reduce the recidivism rate, which historically, and it's still to this day, comes in at around 73% of people who go to prison go back. And Tim said once, prison is like graduate school for young criminals. They learn their trade, they learn their craft, from the older guys, right? So, anyway, we cooked this up and proposed it, and it was accepted because it was Harvard University, and we had the psychiatric approval, and we were working with this prestigious company in Switzerland called Sandoz, with Dr. Hoffman, who was supplying us monthly with psilocybin. I can still visualize the little bottle with a little triangle on it, with little blue pills. So we had a supply of those that was being renewed on a monthly basis. So we cooked up this proposal, and it was accepted because from the perspective of the criminal justice and mental health establishment, we were utilizing we were doing a pharmacological intervention, which is quite common, basically. And at that time, I don't know how it is now, but at that time, prisoners would receive what was called good time. They would receive time off their sentence if they volunteered for experiments, using drugs of all types that were designed ultimately for clinical applications, retail sales. But it was part of the kind of testing process to test them on humans. And most humans didn't want to be tested with these experimental drugs, but people in jail would volunteer because they'd get time off. So nobody knew anything, really. Nobody was really aware of the history of psychedelics in this worldview, in this criminal justice system. They just thought we were, again, experimenting with a drug to see if we could affect behavior change. So it was accepted, and a few months later, we walked into the prison early in the morning, around 8 a.m. The prison looked like a scene out of a Gothic novel. It was 100 years old at that time, I think. It was one of the first prisons in New England. And it was like a scene out of a Frankenstein set, with gigantic cast iron or steel doors and clanging, none of the modern prison kind of technology. So I can still remember walking across this big courtyard into the back of the essentially a rotunda, you know, at the back where there was the hospital wing of the prison. And we had reserved a room there, a fairly large room with about 15 cots. And we were locked in there from about 8 a.m., 8:30 a.m. in the morning till about 5 at night. And we had, I think, 12 to 15 inmates.
Okay, time to go.
Somebody needs to mute their mic. So we were, it was either Tim or I, or Tim and Ralph, or Ralph and I, and we would change. We would do like essentially one session a month. And then we'd go back in the following session and kind of do a review. One of us would take psilocybin. One of us would not. We call that kind of ground control. Half of the prisoners were given psilocybin, half were given a placebo. And again, we were locked in there for a good 6-7 hours or more. And a lot of interesting things happened. It was, as I reflect now, years later, I how far out is this, to actually go into a maximum security prison with a bunch of, convicts, these academic, us as academics, right? And be locked in with human beings where we actually were able to discover our common humanity. And and the roles of doctor, patient, criminal, Harvard professor, graduate student, all those roles and identities kind of shifted like very quickly, within within less than an hour as the psilocybin was coming on, basically. And there were a lot of profound experiences. I'm happy to share one or more of those with you if you're interested. They're interesting anecdotes, things that things that,
I think so. I mean, to tell some of those experiences, and then one of the other questions is, what is the setting there? When you're sitting there, is it everybody take it and be quiet as they're talking? What does that look like? And what are some of the experiences people are having?
Well, we had a few kind of initial ground rules, I recommended that people kind of be quiet for the initial period to allow the experience to unfold. It wasn't really nothing really mandatory or super authoritarian at all. Given the setting parameters, you can imagine like being in a gray concrete fluorescent lighting environment. Not the best environment, and the expectation, the sets. These the inmates didn't know. They just thought they were experimenting for a pharmacological experiment. There was curiosity as to why they would be there for so many hours. But anyway, we tried to change that. We brought in some Indian prints and a little bit of incense. We had to stop the incense almost immediately, because once we lit the incense sticks and the guards came to the door and knocked, I think they thought we were smoking pot in there. So whatever it was, we had to stop that. So we had a bit to overcome with respect to set and setting, but we managed it. And so one anecdote, a couple anecdotes I can share with you was I was working at one point with a inmate there who had been, he was in his early 40s, had spent most of his life in jail. Had been really a criminal, had been incarcerated off and on since his early teens. And his brother also was in prison in Walpole on death row. These two guys were Irish mafia hitmen and extortionists and you name it, So I was sitting on a stool at the edge of his bed. He was laying there with his eyes closed and not moving at all and not responding to any questions I was asking. I knew we were all learning, but I knew enough how to be a good guide, and I just created a lot of space and a lot of, just a lot of space and patience and kindness. And but I saw that his body was stiffened, and he was rigid, and I knew he was undergoing a lot of internal conflict, and nothing I could do would get him to open his eyes or speak to me, or nothing I could do to ease his suffering. And so it was very frustrating. So I spent a few hours there doing whatever I could do in a very, again, a very gentle way. And I walked out of there really frustrated, not knowing, what had happened. Well, when we went back, like 2 weeks later, I think it was, to do the review, he was chipper and he was fine and communicative. And so I asked him, I said, what was going on there? And he said, I thought you guys had given us a truth serum. It's an interesting, analog. And we're looking to pick my brain as to the crimes that I had committed that I hadn't been busted for. And I was going through a lot. These are my words, he didn't say it quite this way. He said, I was going through a lot of fear and a lot of conflict about that. And I was actually working on a plan to have you killed by, some of my colleagues in Boston. And we both laughed about that because it was so outrageous. It was like such a far out paranoid, kind of identity at that point that neither of us could take it actually seriously in retrospect. So we had an interesting bonding there, and that was one experience I had. A few years later, I was teaching and working at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I got a call earlier that day from him. And he said, Gunther, I'm out. I'm on probation. And I'd like to come and see you. We haven't seen each other since, that period. So I said, sure, Jim, come over. Come on over in the early evening when people have left. And so he came by and he shared with me that he had violated parole, the day before, and he was on the lam, and he was going to be sent back. And at this point, I think it was either 3 strikes you're out or whatever the law was, but he was facing the rest of his life in prison. And he said, so I'm leaving town. I'm leaving the state. You'll never see me again. But I wanted to just thank you for the work we did. It changed my life. He said, I no longer have committed any violent crimes. He said, I'm a criminal. He said, that's how I make my living. I don't know anything else. It was really beautifully honest. And he said, but I've never hurt anyone, physically since then. And he expressed to me the transformation that he experienced. And we gave a big hug, and he left, and that was it. So that was one experience in the prison. Do I have time for another one?
Yeah, I'll just sit here all day and we'll listen to this as long as you've got. I'm good. I know that we've got some time, but this is being recorded. I know people are bailing here and there, but please, Gunther, please continue. Give us another anecdote.
So at one point, it was a session where I had taken psilocybin, and I was sitting on a chair, and I started speaking, and I fell into a kind of very lucid, very, very articulate kind of ongoing kind of narrative, and it was really powerful. And I, as I was looking at the room, I could see that the people there were like captured by my ideation, if you will, and my energy. And I was kind of fascinated by that. And there was like an aspect of control and power that I felt, that I was actually that I was I had never felt that before, that kind of power of kind of psychic, etheric control. And I was exploring that, and I was speaking, and then suddenly what came in was like an enormous sense of guilt and shame. And I saw what I was doing and how my ego had completely taken over. And I felt really badly, and I felt suddenly very weak, and I fainted. The next thing I know, I'm laying on a cot. I can see it now as we're speaking. I'm laying on a cot, face up. I'm looking up at a sea of faces above me, looking down at me with compassion and love and concern about my own well-being as I came out of the faint, And are you okay, Gunther? And there was a lot of love and a lot of compassion for me, and it was so sweet, because I realized what had happened to me, and how the nature of our relationships there with criminals, basically. Lifer. They weren't lifers, because we picked people who had to have release dates so that we could measure the recidivism rate. But nevertheless, as I said earlier, the kind of hierarchical distinctions between doctor and patient and Harvard and this and that, all that kind of dissipated. So the experience I'm just telling you about now, which actually happened to me as in terms of I became a client there for them in that moment, so it was pretty sweet, pretty interesting. So.
Yeah, that's it's beautiful when this medicine can bring you together, and you can laugh about a gentleman planning your hit during his experience, right? Thank you for that. That's obviously tremendous. And I also know you were involved in the Good Friday experiment. I think that we should, being today is Good Friday.
It is. Yeah.
So let's
timing
for a moment. I think that's
so that experiment was conceived by Dr. Walter Pankey, who was an MD in Boston, and was also at that time a student at the Harvard Divinity School, getting his PhD in divinity studies. And I think he had some experience with psilocybin before we met, but one thing led to another, and we jointly conceived and then organized the Good Friday experiment, which was held at Marsh Chapel at the BU campus. The divinity students actually came from Andover Newton Theological Seminary. The dean there, I've forgotten his name now, had taken psilocybin with Tim, and was very interested in supporting that. So the thesis there, the hypothesis, if you will, was can it actually produce a mystical experience, a mystical Christian experience? So, of course, in reading the literature of psychedelics, from the Illusion and Mysteries to the curanderos to, those of you who have kind of an anthropological bent, or historical understanding of the role of these substances in societies immemorial. We were well primed to explore that hypothesis in that context. So the set basically was that of divinity students who were interested in mysticism. The setting was a chapel on Good Friday, perfect moving parts, if you will, of set and setting. And we conducted that experiment, and it was very powerful. Again, that we were using a placebo there as well, and it was so powerful that a number of the students who were on placebo had psychedelic experiences, because the setting was so powerful, and it was the magnetism of those that had taken psilocybin. Their energy was so contagious, if you will. So that was quite successful in that way. It was very powerful. We had a few challenges there. One guy in particular kind of kind of lost it and went running down the street. And we kind of had to, find him and corral him and gently bring him back. And I think actually Panky, again, it was an MD, was able to administer, I think, a niacin injection. I think niacin was being used at that time when in certain environments, certain settings, when particularly in psychiatric settings where people were having really bad trips, a niacin injection would bring them down very quickly. But that was only one out of, I don't know how many people, there were about 15 people there, 15 of the students. So Panky unfortunately died a couple of years later in a scuba accident. So he had a very interesting, promising career, kind of both with a divinity and a medical degree, and looking at this early on, looking at this psychedelic space through those two lenses.
Very interesting. And those are two, obviously, again, very referenced studies. It's tremendous to chat with someone who's involved with creating those. So thank you for that. Now, after those experiences and this progress that is being made and these studies are being set forth, talk to us about what shut those down. What kind of led to the end of the efforts that you guys had put forth?
Well, there's a lot of moving pieces to that story. Okay, there's the West Coast versus the East Coast, for example. So the East Coast is pretty much like Harvard and Cambridge, and and the work we were doing. Then there's the whole West Coast scene with with the school bus and what was his name, Ken Kesey, right, and that scene, right. So. And then throughout the country, people having bad trips, mostly recreational use, a lot of uncontrolled substances, that with odd admixtures of elements of psilocybin and methamphetamines and all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and then. People like, for example, Art Linkletter. I don't know if you remember, he was a kind of a television MC at that time. And his daughter had jumped out of a window. She had been suicidal, and so he was on a rant. He brought it to the Nixon administration. G. Gordon Liddy, who was a district attorney, I believe, just a DA in Poughkeepsie County, which was where in Warwick, New York, which was the center where the team went after Harvard. We were being backed by by patrons in New York, out of the very wealthy patrons who. Hitchcock family, Peggy Hitchcock and her two brothers are part of the Mellon family. So, we were in, I joined a little bit later and left early because that wasn't my cup of tea there, but basically it was like 3,000 acre estate, with this enormous old home, with 20 bedrooms, and it was just an enormous place. So that's where basically Tim and Dick and Ralph ended up. I spent a summer there. I actually left my teaching position at Brandeis that Abe Maslow had recruited me for, and because Abe recruited me because he was writing at that time about peak experiences. He had kind of completed his work on self-actualization, and he was very interested in the religious experience and peak experiences at the kind of cutting edge of humanistic psychology. So, and we were in the business of producing these sessions on a weekly basis. So. He and I met, we hit it off. He encouraged me to apply for the position, and then he went out of his way, expended a lot of political capital to get me there, hoping that we could work together on this. He had never taken psilocybin himself. He actually, or any psychedelic, he was actually a bit of afraid of it, and but a lovely man, and. I left after the first year. I had an initial 3-year contract as an assistant prof but I left after the first year to join Tim and Dick and Ralph up in Millbrook, New York. And he was very unhappy with me, and he forgave me, but just that was what I needed to do at that time. My parents weren't very happy either. Being coming out of graduate school and all of that, kind of beginning political chaos around the scene, to land a job with Abraham Maslow at a Jewish university, no less. So God bless my dear parents who were a bit upset at that time, but everything settled down. So I've kind of lost my train of thought here with these anecdotes, but basically things blew up. Okay, there were a variety of factors that led to that. Not the least of which was Tim's own behavior and his own attitude. And I say that with a lot of love for him, because there were unexamined aspects for him emotionally. There were shadow aspects that were never, in my opinion, fully addressed. And one of those pieces, which was also part of kind of an endearing quality of him and its positive manifestation, was this kind of magnetic, charismatic, humorous personality. But it had a dark side, which was a very kind of anti-authoritarian streak. So, and that it wasn't just political authoritarianism in the sense of left, right, or center. Tim didn't care if you were a left, right, or center. If you were acting in an authoritative way with him, he was very negative, in a very negative response to that. And that went back to, if you've read his biography or autobiography, going back to his early days at West Point and being raised in a Catholic family and having a kind of I would say almost kind of a DNA, kind of Irish Black poet DNA, which is sort of like excuse the expression, a kind of fuck you attitude to any kind of authoritarian, effort. He carried that a lot of his life. So, and some of that is, some of the extreme aspects of that were the result of all the pressures and then being busted for having half an ounce of grass on him in the Mexican border, and and being subject to a lot of political persecution. I think it was Nixon who said at the time that Tim Leary is one of the most dangerous men in America. So it was all unraveling. It was very complex, and we were in the middle of all of that. And as I said, Richard Ramdas was fired. Tim was fired from Harvard. Ralph was permitted to continue. I was permitted to continue to finish my degree. I was, interestingly enough, the person that supported me in being able to continue there, because there was a lot of pressure of the faculty to get the clean house, right, was Gordon Allport, a famous psychologist who, coming full circle, had read of my father's research in German in psychology, and had been interested in my father's research in synesthesia. Interestingly enough, my dad as a young psychologist experimenter, was working in synesthesia, which, as most of you know, is a phenomenon that arises in psychedelic experience. My dad had never had any psychedelics, but he was working on that. It came to the attention of Gordon Allport at Harvard, who then, hearing of my dad's plight with Nazi Germany, arranged for his teaching position so we could actually get a visa to come, permission to come at a small Quaker college, because Gordon was a Quaker. And so that's how that came full circle at the time. So Gordon Allport kind of intervened, because he was a heavy hitter there at Harvard, in world famous, actually, in terms of his work. And so he intervened to help me finish my degree. So I got a degree quickly. I got out, and that's when Abe offered me that teaching position as part of that transition. So I went to Millbrook, as I said a few minutes ago. I was there for the summer. I had one profound experience, their psilocybin experience, that actually was a dream that I had after a psilocybin experience that night when I was sleeping, where I visualized myself in front of a kind of what am I trying to say here? A dashboard, okay, with a radiation meter and a large flywheel, like a ship's wheel, and it was a lead-lined chamber. And I was having this dream, and I was lucid in the dream as I was having it. I was completely awake and lucid, awake in the dream as I was having the dream. And the goal was to open that shuttle valve or that wheel to keep the needle at the red line, to maximize the amount of cosmic radiation I was receiving. And I realized at the moment that what I was experiencing was like a trailer of my life, if you will. Okay, that the symbolism didn't need to be interpreted after the fact in some kind of Jungian way. It was like, it was right there, self-evident in my face, what I was doing with my life, basically. You know, I was redlining my life. You know, my son and daughter were like 3 years old and 5 years old and 3 years old. And my wife, who, you know, was not too happy being there because it was not a good place to raise kids. I left after 3 months and went back to Boston, Cambridge, and kind of dropped back in after having dropped out. Got a couple of quick gigs and then ended up back in academia for a number of years before I dropped out again. But the second dropout was to kind of go into my professional work in business and other interests that I had. So, and I've been doing that since.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, and such beautiful reflections. You know, reflecting on Tim and that more personal experiences that you had are just such value to this group and hopefully anybody who sees this in the future. So thank you for that. And I know that we're kind of at time that we allotted. I don't know if you're willing to spend a little bit more time with us. There's a few things I'd like to kind of get towards, but before that, I know other people might have to go. If there's any burning questions right now that, again, in to honor the time that Gunther has given us, if there are any, now's the time to ask those. And if you're willing, I would like to go a little bit further into the state of things now and how this, we keep saying Renaissance. I would like to change that word just because when I think of the Renaissance, it's a Renaissance for us Westerners, but it's not a Renaissance for the very many indigenous people who've worked and died for thousands of years to keep this stuff going. But before we go to that, are there any questions that we need to ask?
Well, we've got a couple in the chat box. So first one is, I really love the idea of contagious energy within the Good Friday participants. Dr. Weil, do you think that this contagion is acute or is it potentially persistent? That is, for individuals who have undergone psilocybin healing, could their overall alteration in consciousness positively impact the people around them?
Yes, I think that's definitely a possibility, and particularly in the months succeeding the experience. There is a kind of curve here, a diminishing curve. Anyone who's explored this personally or professionally has to acknowledge that the good news is there is this capacity for insight and deep transformation, and it clearly has some lasting effects for a number of months, maybe up to a year. But the key question here, which is now being addressed more and more, is what kind of support systems are needed following that in order to create the integration. We have the same issue at the Concord Prison Project, because when we did a follow-up study, a couple of years later, and by the way, Rick Doblin was doing his PhD or master's thesis at BU, I believe. And it was on the top. His topic was the Concord Prison Project. That's how I first met him, and then he organized a meeting which we held at Tim's house in Beverly Hills, up in the mountain, up in the hills, where we were able to find the still living and remaining members, inmates of the prison project. And but we raised a little money. They came together there, and we had an interesting debrief a few years later around that. But one of the things we discovered in that connection was that we needed to have some kind of follow-up program. So we looked to actually develop a kind of 12-step program based on the AA model. And by the way, there's a whole interesting history of the founder of AA and his LSD experiences. Some of you are familiar with that. Won't go into that now. So we contacted a man named Chuck Diederich, who had founded Synanon, which was an addiction, 12-step addiction program, and particularly for inmates, for criminals. And so we worked together with him to create a custom program for our folks, but we couldn't raise the money. We just, we were so far ahead of our time. But we realized early that some form of active integration and support is necessary. And the 12-step model I really like, okay? Particularly, I mean, if you separate out some of the kind of, some of the, I don't know, there's some kind of, I don't want to diminish this, but there are some elements, religious, spiritual elements there that I don't think are necessarily central to it, okay? More religious than spiritual, if you will. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that follow-up and integration is necessary. So going back to the question, there's this diminishing curve and something is needed. And I'm of the opinion that at the end of the day, the psychedelics provide a portal to a much deeper transformative awareness, but the real work has to be done day to day in terms of whatever psychospiritual practices or support people need to do in order to maintain that. At the end of the day, they're like a gift, if you will, of giving you a preview of coming attractions, okay? But in and of themselves, the psychedelics cannot carry the burden or the weight of creating permanent change. And if one recognizes that limitation, then one can look really at the strength of creating the possibility for people of realizing who may not have any understanding of what their true potential is, as human beings, who we really are in our core as presence awareness, and compassion and love. And that is who we basically are, at our core. And so it can point to that. More than point to it, it can open the window, can open the portal of that, and create at least a very powerful simulation of the real thing, which is not to be underestimated. No, it needs to be encouraged and supported, but also knowing the limitations. Because historically, when people, in my opinion, and I've seen this, and it's also been written about, particularly, for example, in one of the spiritual traditions that I gravitated to at the end of the psychedelic period, I was introduced to the Gurdjieff work early on. And I met my first teacher in the Gurdjieff work, who had worked with Gurdjieff himself. His name was Willem Nyland in New York City, who also had a group in Boston. And what got me interested originally was Ralph Metzner gave me a page to read out of Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, about his work with Gurdjieff. And they were talking about psychedelics. They were talking about the use of certain substances that could be utilized by people to gain a access to their potential. And then he went on to say that, but if these experiences are constantly repeated in order to try to make that permanent, it leads to madness or death. That was Gurdjieff's line on that, and I thought it was extremely prophetic in retrospect. So.
Thank you. I think that's such a great answer. And it really speaks to a lot of what we see coming out now about the importance of integration and really the fact that this is a tool and not something to just rely on as the solution. We have another interesting question in the chat, kind of switching gears a little bit. Would you change any of Maslow's ideas around self-actualization?
Yeah, in fact, I have. Basically, the work I do on with the values model and the worldview model that underlies it, we place the self-actualization as a stage in the developmental sequence, if you will. If you look at it through, for the moment, if we're looking at it through a developmental lens, actualization and self-actualization is sort of at the sweet spot in the middle of that developmental transition, moving towards what I call, emerging order and prophetic consciousness, if you will. I'm not going to go into the details of that now. So I believe that, that Abe did the best he could at the time with the tools he had and his own experience of developing the self-actualizing model to the point he did. There, in the interim, I think there's an author named Kaufman who did a book in the last couple of years, kind of revisiting Maslow and looking at transcendence as another stage in that, in that development. And there are other people who've been kind of nibbling at that, but in my values work and the model of the kind of the 7 worldviews and the attendant values of these worldviews, self-actualization, again, as I said a moment ago, is a point of a shift in consciousness, a shift in values from a kind of hand-me-down hierarchical or more kind of structured and linear consciousness to one that is more open-ended and more non-linear and more kind of eventually moving more and more towards a kind of quantum model of I think best articulated, not articulated by many people, but I'm particularly fond of David Bohm's implicate order model of the kind of underlying implicate order that the psychedelics can actually open up an understanding of that. So, and in terms of the worldview model, that again is a different kind of destination or different type of consciousness. So everything kind of has its place in that, but and so it's kind of an interesting way that my work in values, which came about 20, 25 years ago, and I kind of stumbled on that, having gone through a period of time where I was really questioning whether the work I was doing with individuals and organizations was having any impact, particularly working on values. I decided to take a deep dive into that whole topic and eventually found a piece of intellectual property that my colleagues and I have continued to refine over the years that would actually go in and actually empirically measure values and worldviews. So that's the tool that I've been crafting and working with since. And interestingly enough, one of the things that I'm curious about right now, coming full circle, again, is I'm really interested in seeing if I could deploy the values inventory as a pre-post measure for people working with psychedelics. Okay? There's a lot of psychometrics that are being used in laboratories and settings all over the world, mostly around anxiety scales and things like that. But I don't think anyone has really, other than anecdotally, gone in and tried to really profile and measure the actual shift in worldviews that happens. And this is, like the near-death experience or the ego-death experience that happens with psychedelics when they're utilized optimally for this kind of transformation. There is a fundamental shift in the worldview. People experience the lenses through which they're looking, okay? And they realize the arbitrary nature of the lenses they're looking through, which is, having that kind of witness consciousness, which can create the necessary aesthetic distance between you and the lens, and whoever the you is at that point that is looking at through that lens. That's a profound transformation. And that can last for a while. But again, as I said earlier, there is a tendency, what is now being called kind of in neuroscience, the default neural network, right? Which is the self-referential egoic network. The conditioned patterns, the neuronal patterns are so established, so kind of conditioned and locked in that you have this temporary suspension of that and through kind of a neuroplasticity, but then the old patterns will come back unless they're really actively addressed in moment-to-moment consciousness. And that means starting on the meditation cushion with mindfulness or something along those lines, or open focus or something along those lines. But the real challenge is getting off the cushion and operating daily life. Okay.
Thank you.
That to me is where it really counts. And if it doesn't show up there, what's the point?
Thanks so much. And I think we have one more question from Trey. Do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Gunther. Also, thank you for mentioning David Bohm. The Wholeness in the Implicate Order is like one of my favorite books of all time. It's incredible. So this is also about Maslow, but Bill Richards told me that Maslow never took LSD, even when he was working on the self-transcendence stuff. Is that accurate?
That's the rest of my knowledge. Never with, or psilocybin, never took a, he was actually very cautious. Abe was an interesting character. He was ahead of his time. He was a kind of lone wolf in the Department of Psychology at Brandeis. He occupied a weird position in that department because on the one hand, you had on the kind of left-hand side, so to speak, I'm kind of arbitrarily creating this here, but the left wing of that department were the psychoanalysts, the right wing were the cognitive psychologists, and here was Abe in the middle as a humanist psychology criticized by both of the wings, basically, who considered him like kind of a tree hugger or whatever it was. So he like so many people of that ilk, he was ahead of his time, and he was it doesn't pay to be a prophet in your hometown, basically. So he had a lot of insecurities. And so he was very interested. I remember conversations with him, but he was like a kind of moth to the flame, but he couldn't really let himself, permit himself to take that step. He complained a lot. We kind of saying he kvetched a lot, to use the Yiddish, phrase. He was a kvetcher, but a lovely man, very sweet man.
Thank you. And I think we have one more question that'll actually be a pretty good segue, Del, to where you wanted to head. Addie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Gunther, first of all, I wanted to express my deep and sincere gratitude. I'm incredibly moved and I feel so honored and privileged to have been a part of this conversation today. Thank you so much for all the work you've done over your lifetime. We're all indebted to you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So, as you're aware, Measure 109 is going to be implemented in Oregon, which creates a framework for psilocybin-assisted experiences. Right now, there is an open comment period where the public can comment on the current rules and regulations that they're proposing. One of those, or rather the lack of requirements, is that there is no requirement for integration. And given what you've said about Gurdjieff, I think it brings up a lot of concerns that, that the work will be not only left undone, but potentially there could be some true harm that could be introduced by the lack of integration. So
yes.
I guess the most concise way I could say this is if you were going to make a direct plea to the regulators in the state of Oregon about integration, what's the most concise way that we could beg them to require integration?
I would say it's mandatory that whatever evidence exists, and this might be in your purview to assemble that, both anecdotal and empirical. We know that the neuroplasticity or the reshuffling of the neuronal networks that happened, and by the way, there was just an article published in the New York Times a couple of days ago on this, on the most recent research on this. We know that is not lasting. So that we have to pay attention to the neuroscience here. And invoking the neuroscience, I think, here would be a real asset for you. Because it is science, but I think you also need to embellish that with the anecdotal accounts of people who are therapists, people who have worked in the space. And for me, I would make it a mandatory, a requirement that a robust and intelligent and follow-up program be initiated that would include moving pieces of mindfulness and trauma follow-up, working with some of the better pieces of trauma work that are emerging in recent years, including polyvagal theory and other stuff like that. So if it were me, I would look to create a solid, robust program. And that also I would, in addition to that, I would look at creating some sort of intake screen for people coming into the program to select people who are motivated to do the follow-up work, if you can get at that.
Great. So if I could restate that to you, that on intake screening, you would potentially select or have an exclusion criteria for people who are not willing to do follow-up work after the session?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And I think there's some ways of getting at that through interview questions. I mean, a simple one is, are you willing to commit to 6 to 12 months or whatever you decide here of a program? You're going to make that commitment reasonable, right, in terms of scheduling and logistics and costs and so on. But something of that nature, I think, would be essential.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Gunther. Yes, and thank you for that question. And that is very relevant. And I'm going to only ask you for another 10 minutes, if that's okay. That's a half hour over what we've gotten, and very grateful for that. But kind of in that spirit of all these newer laws that are being set forth, Colorado will be on the ballot this year for a decriminalize and legalization of all entheogens here in November if they collect enough ballot signatures. What are your thoughts around the emergence of laws that are being passed around psilocybin use or other entheogens? Is this of concern? Is this obviously late? Or, I mean, where do you feel, someone who's pioneered this back in the 60s?
Well, we had different challenges in the 60s. In the 60s, we were challenged with just ignorance and people didn't know about this. And
we got plenty of that still. We've got plenty of that still. That's not
okay.
isolated to the 60s.
Yeah. But here, I mean, if you look at the density of coverage in the last couple of years with Pollan's book, and then every day, there's even a psychedelic journalism program that has started at UC Berkeley, basically, so I think, you're closer to it than I am, Del, so I don't want, but nevertheless, I think there was a different scale at that point, right? Now, what concerns me are two things. One is the rapid commercialization, particularly, companies like Compass, for example, that are attempting to trademark or copyright set and setting. I mean, it's like ridiculous, It's like, we stole the set and setting idea from the indigenous cultures, kind of appropriated it, if you will, and labeled it set and setting. But we learned that through the indigenous cultures because they were aware of this for centuries. But now you have, a company that's attempting to kind of prototype their own version and patent that. To me, it's ridiculous. You also have situations where companies are kind of tweaking molecules, and looking to establish a toehold to gain a patent by manipulating one or two molecules. And part of that is informed by a desire to, in some circles, to eliminate the psychedelic experience and treat these substances similar to, serotonin uptake inhibitors, basically, right? Kind of turn them into a kind of Prozac with a different biochemical framework. I mean, they're considering the psychedelic experience to be a negative side effect. So I'm concerned about that with the kind of medicalization, the pharmacalization, if I could make up that word. So I'm concerned about that, you know. At the same time, I like the idea and I support the idea of decriminalizing, basically. I'm not sure at the moment. I really haven't thought this through yet, and I'd love to have some conversations with attorneys and other folks who are, you know, legal theorists and so on, working in this space to see what would be some of the seventh generation implications of setting in motion a law, legalization versus a decriminalization. Okay, there are implications that often we're not aware of in the heat of creating laws, basically, in terms of their implications. I think we need to kind of game that out, if you will, to look carefully at what are some of the potential positive and negative aspects of that. I don't know, am I answering your question here on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're spot on with a lot of the things you're stating that are of concern. I think it's of concern to a lot of the grassroots folks who've worked hard to push this forward. I know that when we did Decrim Denver, which is May 7th, 2019, we're coming up on just a few years, the amount of expansion into this space in that short period of time is to some degree, even to myself now, like concerning, where it's, you know, be careful what you wish for to some degree, where, yes, hey, did we really think this through? Where I think a lot of the folks who even worked on the Decrim Denver, as this new initiative is being set forth in Colorado, a lot of things like, okay, we see that you're talking about decriminalization, which I'm absolutely for. I'm decrim first, always. That's where I've always stated. The legalization, that opens up access to a lot of people who aren't going to sit in a circle with a shaman or things of that nature, right? That's a model that we have in the Western world. But the consensus that I hear from a lot of people who've, you know, been proponents of this is we have got to slow down. We've got to just like,
for example, look at the ketamine scenario right now. Okay, so you have ketamine is the only legal psychedelic, you know. So at the moment there are ketamine clinics bringing up all over the country, kind of little mom and pop operations in some case. People go there, they spend like, you know, $1,000 or whatever. They're given a you know, probably either an IV or a you know, a inhalation. They're there for an hour or so, or 2 hours generally, and they're sent home then with a sublingual supply of sublingual. There's no follow-up. There's even a company online that's providing like psychiatric interviews online and then sending you the psilocybin like a prescription drug. You know, to me, that's mind-boggling. Okay, and it really concerns me. And it's fueled by the commercialization, basically by, you know, the drive towards dollars, basically. So, you know, I could see something like that happening under the legalization rubric. That's exactly what I was getting at, and which you pointed to in your comment. You look, for example, at the marijuana legislation in Colorado. I totally support it. I've enjoyed cannabis my whole life. I mentioned it earlier. At the same time, there are issues arising, for example, in Boulder High School, and I'm sure it's happening all over the country, where young boys and girls are basically like spaced out. They can't do their academic work. They're not motivated. They're dropping out. There's some real issues that are of concern to very liberal parents who support the legalization of marijuana, you know, but how do we address those issues? Okay, so there are always these consequences and so, you know, kind of evoking the spirit of the Iroquois nation. What are the seventh generation implications as that pebble drops into the center of the pond, and, you know, and the concentric energies move out? You know, what can our wise elders, our prophetic understanding what can we expect or kind of predict or look at it even through a kind of probabilistic lens, are some of the implications of what we're doing now, some of the downsides. So
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation, as much as I'd love to continue and I want to honor everybody's time. But yes, the 7 generations, what are the effects of the things that we're doing? But I think chatting with folks like you who have obviously such a deeper history than everybody on this call in this thing. We're humbled for the opportunity to listen to you and learn from you. And I hope that the members here will take this and we'll figure out a way to post this. Hannah, maybe you could work to figure out and send this link to everybody, but to kind of get Gunther's workout. And we are so humbled that you've taken the time. Gunther, I'm so humbled to call you a friend, and that you've given us this opportunity multiple times, and have spent time with myself and Heather and this group today. Gunther, thank you so much for you and your work and your history. And I hope to get together and have coffee or tea in person, maybe at the tea house in Boulder very soon.
yeah, I'm beginning to venture down from the mountain.
Yeah.
You know, and hoping this new subvariant doesn't hit us again with another wave. So, well, I think we'll know more about that in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So,
well, I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe we can get tea in the coming weeks and enjoy the spring that is coming forth with new life. So, Gunther, as always, humbled and grateful for you and everybody who joined. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the opportunity. And Hannah will kick out a link to this call for you guys to reflect on, because there's so much knowledge in it. So thank you, Gunther. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.
We will speak soon.
Okay.
Thank you.